The war between Ukraine and Russia is locked in the arena of critical clashes between Donetsk and Zaporizhia. In line with Kyiv's grand offensive plans, the Ukrainians are making a great effort to sever the connection roads between the Melitopol, Tokmak, and Zaporizhia front lines of the Russian troops and the Donetsk region. As a result of Kyiv's offensive operation plan, the Russians took action when Orikhiv, one of the most strategic front lines of Zaporizhia, was attacked by Ukrainian forces. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu reported that a major Ukrainian offensive consisting of 150 armored vehicles and 1,500 tanks was repelled south of Zaporizhia. But the trajectory in this region did not go as Shoigu had reported. For the first time, the Ukrainian army mobilized Western tanks and launched simultaneous offensive operations from the southwest and southeast of Orikhiv. Ukraine's huge tank battalion included numerous German Leopard 2 tanks and US Maydam 1 Bradley armored vehicles. Simultaneous Ukrainian attacks on Vasilivka, southwest of Orikhiv, and Poloi, southeast of Orikhiv yielded results. Russian forces in both areas were repulsed. Ukrainians managed to gain ground here, but the Russians sent out reinforcements against the defeat in the southern lines of Orikhiv. It was at this point that the special forces of the Ukrainian army came into play. The most elite units of the Ukrainian army, known as the White Wolves, were already advancing in the Kamianka-Dniprovska direction to support their comrades fighting in Orikhiv, while the 110th Defense Brigade and the 102nd Defense Brigade of the Ukrainian army were carrying out violent offensive operations in the southeast of Orikhiv. It was claimed that the Russian reinforcements from the Kamiansk-Dniprovsky direction advanced over the city of Zapovednik to support Orikhiv. However, the Kamensko-Dniprovsky direction where the Russian reinforcements wanted to advance was a risky front line, where the counterattack actions of the Ukrainian army were very intense. Also near this area, Ukraine's White Wolf special forces were waiting in ambush. We think the White Wolves had received intelligence that the Russians would support both the clashes in Orikhiv and other front lines in Zaporizhia. Actually, it wasn't that hard to guess because the Ukrainian forces are currently turning the Zaporizhia region upside down. The White Wolves also began to advance towards Zapovednik in full force from the Kamianka-Dniprovska direction and were positioned in a very nice location on the connection road where the Russian support convoys would pass. The White Wolves camouflaged very well in this area as it's surrounded by woodland. On the other hand, a convoy of military vehicles of the 83rd Brigade of the Russian Air Force took all the risks due to the critical situation in Orikhiv and proceeded on its route towards the Zaporizhia region to reach Orikhiv via Zapovednik. In this critical area, the White Wolves, one of the most special units of the Ukrainian army, managed to stop the convoy of the 83rd Brigade of the Russian Air Force near the Zapovednik settlement. After fierce clashes, this Russian convoy was almost destroyed by the Ukrainian special team, the White Wolves. The historical attack operation of the White Wolves was immortalized with unmanned aerial vehicles. In the images reflected on the drone cameras, it was understood that 7 Russian tanks and 15 Russian bunkers and positions were destroyed after the White Wolves successfully completed the operation. It was confirmed that a large number of military equipment was also seized in the destroyed Russian positions. Thanks to this excellent ambush operation, the Russians were not able to carry out military shipments, neither to the city of Orikhiv nor to the front lines in the Zaporizhia region. The White Wolves special team of the Ukrainian army managed to completely break the connection of the Russian army between Kamianka-Dniprovska and Zaporizhia. Therefore, the Russian troops on the Zaporizhia front lines faced serious problems in terms of military equipment. The Ukrainian armed forces, on the other hand, continued to create wonders in the Zaporizhia region, using this situation very well. At the same time that the Ukrainian special forces called the White Wolves stopped the Russian military convoy in Zapovednik, the Ukrainians were conducting an incredible offensive operation in Storazev, southwest of Velika Novosilka. As a result of these striking operations, Ukrainian troops succeeded in capturing the city of Storazev. In fact, the White Wolves played a very important role in the capture of this city. Since this special unit deprived the Russian troops against their comrades in Storazev of military resources, the Ukrainians managed to seize this city easily. But the White Wolves went down in history as the unsung heroes who stood behind the scenes in the operation where they stopped the Russian convoy in Zapovednik. Now the Russians have a much more difficult task. The initial stages of a large-scale offensive operation are the most difficult. The Ukrainians are also fighting without any air superiority, which means more casualties for the reconnaissance elements leading the counterattack. And Kiev has yet to send its best troops into battle. On the other hand, Russian forces launched local counterattacks to reclaim the lost territory. But in most cases, the Ukrainian army was able to hold on to its gains. Russian forces are fighting hard, relying on a combination of minefields, tactical drones, artillery, and strong points to repel the advancing Ukrainians. For now, the Russian forces fought according to an ingenious and sound operational plan. However, with the increase in casualties, it is unclear how long the Russian troops on the front will withstand the mechanized attacks of Ukraine. The number of Russian casualties continues to tend to increase compared to the first days of the counteroffensive. In the past 24 hours, the Russian army, the Wagner Group private military company, and pro-Russian separatist forces have lost about 470 soldiers. Since the Ukrainian army launched its counterattack in Donbass and in the south of Ukraine, Russian forces have lost about 7,000 soldiers and hundreds of heavy weapons systems. In other words, this period corresponds to about a few weeks. Overall, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense reported that as of the last day, Ukrainian forces had killed and wounded approximately 216,650 Russian soldiers. In addition, the Ukrainians managed to destroy 314 combat attack bombers and transport aircraft, 300 attack and transport helicopters, 3,935 tanks, 3,766 artillery pieces, and 7,642 other military equipment belonging to the Russian army so far. Currently, Russian losses continue to increase rapidly with the offensive operations of the Ukrainians on the southern front lines. These figures point to a serious problem for the Russian army. No matter how much the Kremlin, and especially Russian President Vladimir Putin, ignore this problem, the war strategies of the Russian administration proceed in a way that doesn't accept the existence of such a problem. But this is a fact. The troops of the Russian army are running out, and this pushes the Russian Ministry of Defense to take desperate measures. The latest plan to come out of the Kremlin is the official subordination of all private military companies fighting in Ukraine to the Russian army. The Russian administration wants to do this without making it look like a problem. However, Wagner Group financier and leader Yevgeny Prigozhin opposes the plan and refuses to surrender his mercenaries to the Russian army. The aim of Vladimir Putin and Sergei Shoigu here is to use the Wagner forces intensively on the front lines in the Zaporizhia region, as well as in Bakhmut. But Wagner's boss realized this game played by the Russian administration. That's why Russian leader Vladimir Putin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu have a tough job. If the Ukrainian armed forces completely turn the general situation in the Zaporizhia region to their advantage and save all the settlements in this area, the next move of Kiev will be to completely liberate the front lines in the Donetsk region. Among these front lines, one of the most important places and primary targets is undoubtedly Bakhmut. In summary, Russia's future situation looks rather hopeless when we look at today's Ukraine. The Ukrainian army finally put the war beasts on the field with the start of the expected Great Ukrainian Offensive. The Ukrainian army began to go against the Russians with all its might. On the third day of the counterattack, Russian losses exceeded those during the past week, demonstrating to everyone how successful the Ukrainian army officials had devised an offensive plan, with Ukraine demanding modern main battle tanks from its Western partners, and these tanks entering the Ukrainian army inventory in a very short time. It was predictable that German Leopard 2 tanks would be in the field when the counterattack began. All predictions turned out to be correct, and the Ukrainian army took the Leopard 2s into the field. While Kiev confirmed the start of the anticipated major Ukrainian offensive, the Kremlin still denies it. Ukraine sent Western tanks to the front line for the first time after launching the counteroffensive. The Leopard 2 main battle tanks donated by the European allies were put into action during a sudden wave of conflict in Ukraine's Zaporizhia region, which was one of the initial targets of the offensive. The Russians had prepared multi-layered defenses for the anticipated offensive, and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu briefed Vladimir Putin that his forces had defeated a major offensive by Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade in a 2-hour battle in the Zaporizhia region. After this information leaked, Ukraine's defense ministry flatly denied it. Russian drone photos circulating on pro-Kremlin social media accounts show several vehicles, including 2 Leopard tanks, at an intersection outside of Malia Tokmak. Some observers say at least one of the Leopards was among the damaged or destroyed vehicles. However, this information could not be verified in any way. A senior Ukrainian defense official said the Russian reports were exaggerated. The official said that once the counterattack begins, he will not need to ask for confirmation. The main focus of the attacks of the Ukrainian army was the Donetsk region and the Zaporizhia region in the south of the country. These days it is thought that Ukraine may try to recapture the town of Tokmak, about 10 miles south of the current front line. This would split Russia's forces into 2 factions and disrupt Russian transport links between the Russian-controlled areas of Donbass and the Crimea. The Ukrainian army, which also continues the blockade of Bakhmut outside of Zaporizhia, took an area of 1,400 meters around Bakhmut under its control the other day in this counterattack. It is very important that Bakhmut is cleared of Russian forces. Bakhmut was the bloodiest and longest war since Russia started the war. Ukrainian officials reported that in light of the latest developments, the Ukrainian army inflicted heavy losses on Russian soldiers and destroyed military equipment in the region. Earlier today, however, Russia's defense ministry claimed that Ukrainian attacks repulsed the east and south of the country. The Russian Ministry of Defense said that Ukrainian forces made unsuccessful attempts to launch offensives around Bakhmut as well as the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. This comes after Russian President Vladimir Putin said yesterday that the counterattack has not yet begun, claiming that all attempts so far have failed. According to U.S. officials, Vladimir Putin's denials of the Ukrainian counteroffensive mark a significant departure from his previously distant approach to discussing battlefield realities. As a matter of fact, real-time satellite images taken from Bakhmut, Donetsk and Zaporizhia region, and information coming directly from the field refutes Putin and the Russian Defense Ministry. In the last 3 days, the Russian army has lost more than 20,000 soldiers and ammunition. In addition, many Russian soldiers deserted their units during the retreats. That being the case, President Putin's denial of the counterattack is understandable for the Russian people not to withdraw their support for the war. But the reality of the battlefield will soon knock on the door of the Russian president's safe office and reveal itself. Ukraine's defense ministry, which has followed a strict policy of silence about its plans, has hardly responded to news that the counterattack has begun. But according to U.S. officials, Ukrainian officials anonymously informed the Pentagon that the active phase of the counteroffensive had begun. US officials reported that the latest offensive by the Ukrainian military appeared to be the main driver of the offensive. But there was stiff resistance from the Russians, and the Ukrainians could suffer casualties. The Ukrainian offensive appeared to be focused on the Ukrainian-controlled frontline town of Orikhiv. This has led analysts to suggest that Kiev is planning to move towards the coast and cut off Russia's access to Crimea. But Western analysts have long warned that a counteroffensive would be difficult, even with a fresh supply of modern equipment to NATO standards such as main battle tanks. UK Ministry of Defense statements revealed that Ukrainian forces are likely making good progress, forcing Russia to withdraw in some places in an irregular manner. However, progress in their attacks in other areas has been slower, summarizing Russia's response to the attack. UK Ministry of Defense intelligence said some units were probably conducting reliable maneuvering and defensive operations, while others retreated in disarray. The UK MOD also noted a large increase in Russian casualties after several retreating Russian troops were blown up in their own minefields. So what Ukraine's Western partners think about the offensive? The UK Ministry of Defense reported that amid a highly complex operational picture, heavy fighting continues in various sectors of the front, with the Ukrainian army in most areas taking over the grievances. Ukraine also supports cross-border raids by anti-Kremlin Russian militias further north, which it hopes will stretch the Kremlin defenses while maintaining its blockade of Bakhmut. US President Joe Biden, at a press conference with Rishi Sunak at the White House, said he was very optimistic about the unfolding situation. Sunak said it was perfectly reasonable for the United States to ask its allies to do their part, and that the United Kingdom was proud to be the largest contributor to the military effort behind the United States. Based on Prime Minister Sunak's words, it is very important at this point that other allied nations take steps and do their part. Although President Putin thinks that Ukraine's Western partners will wear out, The situation shows the opposite. At the end of the speech, Biden reiterated his unwavering support for the people of Ukraine, whom he said are defending themselves against the most brutal aggression we have seen in a long time at the hands of Vladimir Putin. Russia, on the other hand, targeted civilians fleeing the floodwaters caused by the dam. It detonated near the Ukrainian city of Kherson during the Ukrainian counterattack. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had visited the city minutes before it was bombarded with bombs. After the bombing, it was reported that many civilians lost their lives or were injured, according to initial reports. Russia's attacks on civilians have continued since the beginning of the war. The only reason for this is that Ukrainian civilians are overwhelmed by the attacks and have called for the government to surrender. But at this point, Putin's attacks on Ukrainian civilians are more encouraging than tiring them and increasing the support of the Ukrainian people for their army. We see the results of this support with the Ukraine counterattack, according to the UK Ministry of Defense. Ukraine has made great progress. Just 48 hours after the start of its counteroffensive, the UK MOD has confirmed that the Ukrainian army has already crossed Russia's first line of defense in several places. This came as Vladimir Zelensky confirmed for the first time today that the counterattack had begun. Speaking at a press conference with the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, the president of Ukraine said that after the start of the counterattack, his military commanders were in a positive mood. The war in Ukraine turned into a two-pole clash as the summer season made itself felt. Trench battles take place in cities in Donetsk and Luhansk, such as Ukrainian and Russian forces. Bakhmut, Marinka, Soledar, Kremenna, Svardov. The heavy defeats of the Russian soldiers at the front, the problems of famine, lack of ammunition, and mismanagement are dragging the Russian army into a great collapse. For this reason, the morale and psychological state of the Russian soldiers are not sufficient to fight. For them, living is the first priority, and they have two options for it: escape or surrender to Ukraine. Those who could not find the way to surrender to Ukraine rebelled against the Russian army and escaped. Escape is to risk death, but if they stand at the front, their lives are already in danger. Yesterday, 7 ex-convicts in the Russian army deserted their troops near the town of Soledar in the Russian-controlled Donetsk Oblast. 7 ex-cons escaped with their weapons from the military unit near Soledar. 3 of them were detained in the city of Bryanka, Luhansk region. Luhansk military officials said the soldiers were in a cafe in Bianca and were drunk. Another deserter was shot dead by the fugitives because he wanted to surrender. Therefore, 3 people are currently wanted specifically in Rostov Oblast. 3 people who were caught were taken into custody and their interrogations began. He later reported that Russian law enforcement had detained 2 more people who had fled the military unit. The agency source reported that 1 more person is being sought. At the same time, the authorities reported that the targeted soldiers may have fled in a Kamaz truck or a Mitsubishi pickup truck. Police also obtained license plates of a dozen cars with Ukrainian license plates that may also have been stolen by the fugitives. According to preliminary information from the authorities, the escape took place last week. In total, more than a dozen soldiers are sought by Luhansk law enforcement, and these soldiers are stated to be armed. The whereabouts and identities of the other fugitives are still unknown. There are many reports of desertions, especially from Russian troops in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The Russian army launched a precautionary plan in Rostov Oblast to prevent these desertions. The number of sentries in the troops was increased, and the sentry soldiers were ordered to shoot when they saw a deserting soldier. So what are the reasons behind these desertions? Last week, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that about 20 convicts who had recently arrived to reinforce a Russian contingent near Svardov in Luhansk Oblast had fled the ranks of the Russian army. 2 days later, after the partial mobilization decision by Russian President Vladimir Putin announced last fall, the number of soldiers deserting the Russian army has increased drastically. The most obvious reason for this is that many of them were forcibly conscripted into the military with the decision of mobilization. Russia deployed its mobilized soldiers to the front line without any full military training. Soldiers mobilized during this deployment were given no ammunition except for rusty Soviet-era guns and simple uniforms. Many soldiers took care of their basic needs, and when these soldiers came to Ukraine, they sometimes even had trouble finding a shelter where they could rest. The soldiers who did not want to remain in the army under these harsh conditions also took action to desert their troops and leave the territory of Ukraine. In addition, when the Russian army made these untrained soldiers fight in the front lines, and therefore the loss of people in the Russian army increased to enormous proportions, all the reasons we listed combined, the Russian soldiers had no choice but to desert their troops. Ukraine, on the other hand, is aware of the desertion events in the Russian army. That's why Ukraine is making great efforts to encourage Russian soldiers to desert their troops. So what is Ukraine doing about the desertions in the Russian army? Ukraine will have foreseen these desertions as it has signed a project that will go down in history after the partial mobilization decision of Russian President Vladimir Putin. I Want to Live was launched as a Ukrainian state project designed to help Russian military personnel surrender safely. The aim is to ensure that the Russian soldiers fleeing their units are safely removed from the Ukrainian borders and reunited with their families. At this point, it is seen that the I Want to Live project has been carried on with success. A total of 20,000 people from the temporarily Russian-controlled regions of Russia and Ukraine applied for the I Want to Live project for Russians ready to surrender. During the 8 months of the project, more than 17 million people, 84 of whom we users, visited the I Want to Live website. Despite regular attempts by the Russian Federation Service for Communications, Information Technology, and Mass Media Supervision to block access to the project. Apart from the Russian soldiers, the relatives and loved ones of the soldiers also applied to the phone line. Most of the time, mobilized Russians do not have access to the internet or mobile communication when they arrive in Ukraine, so their families use the I Want to Live line instead. The line I Want to Live undoubtedly became one of the most important turning points of the war as a project that saved the lives of Russian soldiers who did not want to fight in Ukraine. But there were also Russian soldiers who do not know the line I Want to Live and still did not want to fight in Ukraine. These soldiers are surrendering to the Ukrainian forces one by one. Recently, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky addressed the Russians in Ukraine and once again called on them to avoid the mobilization announced by the Russian authorities. It is not a coincidence that the mobilization decision announced by Russia was immediately called mobilization by the citizens of Russia. The Russian authorities know very well that they are sending their citizens to their deaths because they feel that they have no other choice to win the war. According to Zelensky, Russian commanders do not care about the lives of the soldiers mobilized because their only goal is to recruit new soldiers to replace those killed, injured, escaped, or captured. Therefore, almost everyone from all sections of the Russian people was mobilized indiscriminately and joined the army. It's better not to get a subpoena than to die as a war criminal in someone else's land. Better to evade this call for mobilization than to be crippled and then be held accountable in court for taking part in an offensive war. These attacks are absolutely just as Ukraine is defending itself in this war. So what are the negative aspects? Did the partial mobilization decision have? The partial mobilization decision announced by Russian President Vladimir Putin ignited protests in major Russian cities, including Moscow and St. Petersburg, that resulted in hundreds of arrests. There were also reports that some of those detained for the protest were summoned to police stations. In addition, after the declaration of mobilization, a new wave of arson began in the country. Many Russian men decided to flee abroad, especially at the borders of the Russian Federation, with Georgia and Finland. Long queues formed for kilometers and international flight tickets were sold out quickly. But after this decision, Russia took a step back on many issues. They admitted that they could not carry out the mobilization decision properly and that they did not send the mobilized soldiers to Ukraine with full gratitude. Later, Russia's defense ministry announced a number of occupations it said would be exempt from the mobilization order aimed at boosting the war effort in Ukraine. State media workers, bankers, and journalists will survive the partial mobilization announced by President Vladimir Putin. About 300,000 citizens face being called up as part of the ride. Announcing the exemptions, Russia's defense ministry said employers must compile a list of workers who meet the criteria and submit it to their offices, but acknowledged that certain high-tech industries, as well as certain sectors, must be excluded to keep Russia's financial system working. Some commentators observed that the text of the mobilization decree was left ambiguous, potentially allowing for it to be expanded if necessary. They claim that the partial mobilization decision had a secret clause. So does such an item really exist? Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said in a statement that this was inexplicable and referred to the total number of Russians who could be conscripted. Earlier, an unmanned government source had reported that the corrected section allowed up to 1 million people to be summoned instead of the 300,000 reported. Others cast doubt on the veracity of the Kremlin's commitments to contain the draft. Just a few weeks ago, Peskov reported that there was no discussion of mobilization among Russian leaders. Then there were reports across the country that Russian men who did not meet the criteria were called in by local recruiters. The men who had previously exempted from service for health reasons were reportedly summoned by local commanders in Siberia's Irkutsk region. Elsewhere, Russian men have reportedly tried to flee the country to avoid being summoned by conscripts for the first military mobilization since World War II.